Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So a gentleman by the name of Stephen LaFleur, who works with the Fraser Institute, where he's a senior policy analyst, wrote an article recently in the Globe and Mail. To solve Toronto's housing crisis, we must end restrictive single-family zoning policies. And Stephen, you talked about a couple of different things. You talked about the Housing Affordability Task Force that the Ontario government recently released. And I'd like to ask you about that. But also you referenced a Scotiabank report that said that our number of housing units per 1,000 residents in Toronto is one of the lowest in the G7, and that we would need 1 million homes, according to another study in Smart Prosperity Institute, to house the coming population growth. So how, please tell us, does more flexibility for single family homes solve the problem?
Well, so to start off, you mentioned the Scotiabank report. So Canada has the lowest number of housing units per 1,000 residents in the G7. There are a couple of countries that we're close to. We're slightly below the UK, slightly below the US, but there are other countries like France that are far ahead of us.
But it was interesting. You said that Toronto had 360, and the average is 471. So more than 100 more.
Yeah, so Canada as a country is below the G7 average, and Toronto as a metropolitan area is below the Canadian average. So we're below the lowest in that respect. So it's a big challenge that Toronto has, especially because Toronto isn't, it's not like a declining Midwestern American city or something. We have to plan for a lot of growth.
Well, and it also just doesn't make sense to me, because you would think if we've got lower housing units per 1,000 people, that means we got to have a higher number of people per house. And I hear so many stories of people that are single living in a home. So just as when I think about, lots of people for home, I can think about suburbs maybe, but not Toronto.
Well, one aspect of it is we have chronically low vacancy rates. So the rental vacancy rate in Toronto is routinely below 1%, as it is in Vancouver. So there just isn't a lot of flexibility. Whereas in a healthier market, you would hope that there'd be, kind of 2 to 3% vacancy, so that every time somebody needs to move, they're not displacing somebody else, especially when the population is growing. So it's not just people reshuffling around the metropolitan area, it's more people coming to, and other people getting pushed out as a result.
Right.
Part of the challenge is that, so the Ontario government has a growth management plan that includes the Greenbelt, for instance. That means that a lot of the areas where you could theoretically put a lot of new subdivisions are off limits to development. Now, within the context of that, if you're going to also have a growing population, there really isn't much of a choice other than to grow more upwards. And, as much as we think about density as towers, towers are one part of it. But that can't be the whole story, because the vast majority of the land mass in Ontario and in the Greater Toronto area in particular as well is already kind of built up for is planned for and built up with single detached houses.
Right. So
if you look at Toronto, where can you put more people? Well, in the very low density areas. That's really the answer.
Tell me about this. Toronto, this Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report. You reference it, and you say there's 55 separate recommendations.
Yeah. So just for context, the report was leaked and reported on early. So when I wrote the draft, and when I wrote the piece, it was based on the rumors and the reported contents of the report. So we had to kind of scramble at the last minute to adjust to the realities. So it ended up being roughly in line with what we expected. The big finding really, or the big recommendation, was the recommendation to allow 4 units on any lot. So in other words, if you've got a lot that's currently zoned for 1 unit, they would allow for 4 units.
Right.
So that effectively would end single occupancy zoning within Ontario or wherever it's applied to. Initially, the reports were that it would be municipalities above 100,000. I didn't notice that in the report, so it's unclear, once this makes its way through the political process, if at all, what exactly it will apply to. But certainly I would think that the focus would be on Toronto in particular.
So one of the arguments you make in your article is that this type of flexibility with single family homes actually makes sense. Why do you think that?
Well, the challenge is that first of all, we have to grow somewhere. And it is really difficult to just build towers everywhere. They take a long time. There's only so many places where you can really put, 50-story tower without multi-year opposition to building. The other thing is that to build like deeply affordable housing, it's just cheaper to build things like duplexes where you don't have shared amenities. So if you think about, for instance, all the costs that go into building a condo building, you've got things like gyms, you've got elevators, which are incredibly expensive to build and maintain. Whereas if you've got a duplex, for instance, yes, you share a wall and you've got more lots or more housing units on a lot, but you don't have those added costs involved.
Yep.
And they're also easier to incorporate into existing neighborhoods. It's hard to, say we're going to put a 20-story apartment building on, an old small residential street where you probably have to buy up several lots anyway, versus just building, a couple of townhouses. And there's also a lot of places to do it without too much disruption. If you look at neighborhoods in East Toronto, for instance, which are kind of older residential neighborhoods like I live in, most of the houses are kind of attached houses. They're not completely detached. There's a variety of different types of houses. It still has a quiet neighborhood feel, but there are just more people who are able to live in those neighborhoods as a result.
How do you think the populace is going to respond? We talked before about NIMBYism. How's the population going to respond to every house being able to split into 4 units?
Well, I mean, it's always challenging. Obviously, a lot of people, when they made their decision to move to a particular neighborhood, they had a particular neighborhood in mind. On the other hand, neighborhoods change all the time. Whether that be the demographics of neighborhoods changing, for instance, a lot of Toronto, in fact, I believe most of Toronto is declining in population, because what's happening is the household sizes of inner ring suburbs are declining as, people who bought in the 1970s, 80s, et cetera, their children move out. Well, I guess probably more like 90s, but as people move into houses, have kids, their kids move out, and then all of a sudden, you've got empty nesters. So it's 2 people in a detached house versus 4 people, for instance. And so the population is declining. And so there are ways that you can fit more people in if you want, but you have to allow for more flexible uses. As much as a lot of people want to stay in the neighborhoods forever, which is totally defensible, and nobody would force them to move. The reality is that neighborhoods are always in flux, and we can pretend that that's not the case, and we can try to freeze things in time, but ultimately that's not really how it works.
We're chatting with Stephen LaFleur tonight from the Fraser Institute, talking about some changes that have been recommended. He recommends the Ontario Task Force for Affordable Housing has recommended that we allow more flexibility in Toronto than just single family homes, allowing effectively people that have got single family homes to split them into 4 units. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Steve in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Steve LaFleur. He is a senior policy analyst with the Fraser Institute. He's also been a freelance columnist. For 4 years, he worked for the Frontier Center for Public Policy as a policy analyst, a public policy analyst, an intern policy analyst at Wilfrid Laurier. He was a graduate teaching assistant. He's got a BA from Laurentian University in political science, and he's got a master's in political science from Wilfrid Laurier University. And we've chatted before about some housing issues in the Greater Toronto Area, as well as across Canada. Your recent article in the Globe and Mail was primarily about ending rules that require only single family homes. I understand that something like 73% of Toronto is single family homes, and that's actually a reasonably high percentage. Has our zoning done something wrong in the past?
Well, it's not just a Toronto issue. The reality that Toronto faces and the greater Toronto area is that we're a very rapidly growing metropolitan area with a very aggressive growth management plan that prevents a lot of urban sprawl. So when you put those two things together, it creates problems that aren't necessarily as acute in other metropolitan areas. So if you think about the United States, you've got a lot of relatively fast growing municipalities that have a lot of the same bad rules, but what just happens is other communities spring up around, and you've got further and further development outwards. We've chosen as a province to not do that or to limit that through tools like the Greenbelt and the Places to Grow Act. So as a result, we can't really afford to have those same bad rules to the same extent. We have to put housing somewhere. Otherwise, what will continue to happen is we'll continue to have more people not only having to pay more and more to live in the city, but also some people just pushed out altogether. And unlike in the United States, or a lot of metropolitan areas in the United States where you would move to the next community over, it's more of the leapfrog development where people are moving further and further into smaller communities that didn't traditionally, they weren't really magnet communities. And all of a sudden you've got housing prices exploding in places you wouldn't have thought 10, 15 years ago.
You do an interesting comparison in your article about Beaches, East York versus Etobicoke. And you say Beaches, East York is 1/3 the size of Etobicoke, but it has the same number of residents. And one of the reasons why is you say that the beaches were built before the 1960s. So why is that relevant? What happened in the 1960s that meant Beaches is so much more dense than Etobicoke?
Well, so a lot of older development predated a lot of modern zoning rules. So they had more flexibility with what they could do. And so a lot of the housing just ended up being smaller lots and ended up being attached housing rather than detached housing. And so it comes down to the choices we make. So if you look at a zoning map of a ward map of Toronto, for instance, all of the wards are roughly the same population. So it's kind of a handy way to see how different choices play out, because certain wards are a lot bigger. Now we know that they have very similar populations. So what does that mean? Well, it means that there are different land use patterns. And when people think of density, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the time people just think of towers and they think, well, this place is dense, it must have a lot of towers. But that's actually not what's happening in the two communities that I looked at. What's happening is that in the Etobicoke ward that I mentioned, it's kind of tall and sprawl, where it's either towers or single attached houses, versus Beaches, where it's more moderate density throughout. And the same thing persists throughout a lot of the built-up part of Toronto. So you think about some of the inner ring suburbs; they just are older. And therefore, a lot of the buildings are different. If you go to a community like Cabbagetown, which, is frankly quite a lovely neighborhood, it's mostly townhouses. And nobody's going to sit here and tell you that, Cabbagetown is some sort of undesirable neighborhood because they've made that choice. They've just made different choices. So I think we need to make the debate about, accommodating growth, not just about whether we want towers or not. But also how we can fit housing into existing communities.
It's interesting because what you're suggesting is that once the cities got involved in putting in zoning, things got worse. So is cities and zoning the problem rather than the solution?
Well, Euclidean zoning, as it currently existed or was brought in to combat different issues than we face today. So, for instance, one of the main goals of modern zoning was to separate uses. So what you didn't want and what they didn't want when they brought these rules in was things like, having a dirty factory next door to a residential neighborhood. Whereas that's not really a big concern anymore. Whether you have a duplex next door or a single attached house isn't really necessarily a matter for public policy. It shouldn't be, at least. You can argue about whether we should, let people do anything they want. Obviously, there's a case for some restrictions, putting a nightclub that operates until 3 a.m. in a quiet residential neighborhood might not be something you want. But we really do have to ask whether we need zoning rules to say that, you can have 8 people in one house, but not 8 people in the other house, because the other house is 2 families living with a wall between them rather than one large family.
Right. This Ontario Housing Task Force report, Housing Affordability Task Force report, you talk about one of the main issues, which is this being, if you have a single family home, have flexibility of converting it into 4 different units. Do you have opinions on some of the other of the 54 other recommendations?
There are a lot of recommendations. I don't know them all that well. There are a lot of them that are very, very niche. I think that as an overall theme, I think the idea is trying to allow for more flexibility of uses, which would also reduce the cost of providing housing. There are a lot of rules with building codes and such that, whether one agrees or not with the particulars of that regulation, they all add costs. Whether it be concerns about how much shade a building creates, so you've got, in some cases, you have to build to avoid casting too much shade and so forth. I mean, these things add costs, and they reduce the amount of units that you can wedge into a particular development. So there are a lot of things that can be examined and probably aren't really necessary. But the challenge is that historically, over the last half century or so, we've really tilted the scale towards ensuring that existing homeowners face no inconveniences versus affordability. And eventually, we have to rebalance. There has to be more consideration for the fact that, it's really hard for most people to afford housing in places like Toronto, and forget about buying for most people. Not a lot of people have $800,000 to buy a condo unit.
Some of the recommendations are eliminating minimum parking requirements for developments, creating province-wide zoning standards, having mandatory delegation of site plan approvals to staff, taking out city council interference, and eliminating excessive public consultation, which they say is going to get rid of some NIMBYism. Do you think those are good recommendations?
I think so. And one thing that I'll mention is the parking issue has already been largely addressed in Toronto recently, to my great surprise. Because a lot of post-war urban planning has been around automobiles, it's been customary for every city to mandate a certain number of parking units per dwelling unit, which decreasingly makes sense in places like Toronto. I mean, I don't own a car. I don't know what percentage of people in my neighborhood do, but I suspect it's less than half. But yet, historically, we've required a certain number of parking units. And then you need to ask yourself, how much should somebody who doesn't own a parking lot be forced to pay, or a car be forced to pay for parking? A City of Toronto staff report recently found that, I don't remember the exact number, I think it was actually about $100,000 that it costed per unit or per parking space in condo buildings in Toronto. That's a lot of money for somebody to have to throw onto their mortgage in order to pay for something they're not going to use.
No question.
So the city has addressed this, as they should.
What about this mandatory delegation of site plan approvals to staff, taking out council interference? That almost suggests that councillors aren't doing a helpful job, they're doing a harmful job.
Well, I guess the question you have to ask yourself is what we want city councillors to do. Do we want them to make the rules, or do we want them to be people who micromanage the implementation? Ideally, you wouldn't want staff too involved in particulars. Otherwise, they're not just creating rules, they're trying to apply the rules themselves, and that leads itself to some arbitrariness. So I do think that there's a case for that. Now, I should say I haven't given a great deal of thought to this particular issue. I think that with consultations, for instance, I think that there's a case to truncate that process, because if you can just delay and delay and delay forever, all of a sudden the costs involved in development go up. And if you're going to get to a solution anyway, it strikes me as unnecessary. Either something's permitted or it's not, or at least that's how it should be.
Another big recommendation is a bunch of changes to the Ontario Land Tribunal appeal process, where instead of a $400 fee if you want to object, it's going to go to a $10,000 fee, where rather than each party paying their own legal costs, you've got the discretion that adjudicators can force the loser to pay for legal costs. You've got removal of the right of appeal for any projects that have 30% affordable housing. So all these things are would suggest that people are abusing the process of taking different projects to the Ontario Land Tribunal and appealing them. And so it's sort of making things that are proposed easier to get approved. Is that good or bad?
Well, I think there has to be a balance. The challenge is that if we're saying that existing homeowners can draw these processes out forever, that means that we're saying that other people are going to have less access to housing. People should be able to have a say, but if we're going to have a set of rules and those rules are relatively clear cut, then it isn't clear why we have to adjudicate these things forever.
They also had some changes to Heritage Act, which makes it more difficult to do a bulk listing of areas as heritage or retroactive designations of heritage, and also compensating owners when heritage places are designated. What do you think of that?
Well, it certainly can be a challenge. If you're going to blanket designate a heritage zone, all of a sudden, there's not really a lot you can do in terms of adding new units. So it's something that shouldn't be done lightly. Whether it's a specific problem in Toronto, I couldn't tell you for sure. I would merely have suspicions. I won't speculate. But there are trade-offs involved in that. There is something nice about having, a collection of old, nice houses for sure. Do we need the city to enforce that? Maybe in some cases, but I think we need to be really careful about doing things like that because there is quite a trade-off in terms of the ability to develop when you're doing that.
In your column, you made a couple of interesting comparisons to Washington and Paris. And you suggested that Washington actually had lower height limits than we do, but more people, and that Paris is 4 times as dense as Toronto?
Yeah, so Paris, for the most part, because it's an older city, had a lot of apartments that were built before elevators, frankly. And so they weren't able to build that high, but they were able to pack a lot of people into neighborhoods because they just built rows and rows of apartments. So that's one choice that one could make. Washington, D.C. is an interesting example because they have the Height Act, which, depending on who's telling you go by, it roughly equates to not allowing buildings taller than the Capitol building in most cases. So essentially a couple of floors. I think it might go up to 9 or 10. I can't recall exactly the number. It depends a little bit by where you are, but certainly not 50-story skyscrapers. Yet they are able to fit a lot of people because the typical Washington, D.C. neighborhood is townhouses or really small lot-sized houses. So there are all kinds of ways that you can do density. There's no kind of law of nature that you have to do density just by having skyscrapers. So I think that we need to recognize that there are all kinds of ways that you can frankly have pleasant urban, primarily residential neighborhoods. They just don't all have to be single detached houses with large lots. In
your article, you call it sort of the missing middle as the solution. Can you describe or explain what the missing middle is?
Yeah, so that's a term used by urban planners that basically means things between single detached houses and apartment buildings or large apartment buildings. So kind of like duplexes, stacked townhouses, that sort of stuff. Just different types of housing that aren't quite the kind of intensity that you see with a large apartment building, but also aren't single detached neighborhoods. And when you think about trying to add density so you think about a primarily residential street. you can double the density of it by just, knocking down single attached houses and building duplexes. Now, I'm not saying that's what you necessarily want to do in every neighborhood. Maybe people will do that, maybe they won't. But I do think it highlights that that is a way to increase density by quite a bit. And it's hard to see a rationale for not allowing that.
We're chatting tonight with Steve LaFleur. He is a policy analyst with the Fraser Institute. He's recently written an article in the Globe and Mail about single-family homes not being restricted to stay in single-family homes. Its title is "To Solve Toronto's Housing Crisis, We Must End Restrictive Single-Family Zoning Policies." And it sounds like he's in favor of some of the recommendations, if not a lot of the recommendations from this Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report. We're going to take a break and come back more with Steve in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga Night 60. We're chatting tonight with a very smart guy, Steve LaFleur, who is a policy analyst with the Fraser Institute. He's recently published an article, opinion piece in the Globe and Mail in regards to more flexibility for for single-family homes, that single-family home zoning should go away. And one of the articles that you've commented on your LinkedIn, Steve, is about that we're going to welcome 430,000 immigrants in Canada. And I guess I'm not going to ask you whether it's good or bad, but that's a lot of people.
Well, I can't tell you for certain what the right number of people to let into the country is. What I will say, though, is this really does feed into this issue. We know that a lot of people who are coming to Canada want to live in Toronto and Vancouver, and understandably. So we need to be realistic about this. If we're going to have these high immigration targets, we should also have targets to allow enough housing to be built. So you mentioned the Smart Prosperity study that I cited that said we needed to add 1 million homes. The Ontario Housing Task Force said 1.5. That's a lot more houses than we're currently building. So we really need to have some urgency about it. As much as we want everybody to be heard, we also can't let every project be a months long or years long process. If we need housing, we need to find realistic ways to get it built.
I was speaking with a planning expert recently, and he made an interesting comment, and I'm going to quote it if I could. The city has put us in this housing crisis because policy zealots don't think about the need for more housing. And you already talked about parking requirements that have been changed, but he listed parking requirements, limits on density, limits on height that he doesn't agree with, and other regulations that the city has put in place that have dramatically restricted the amount of housing that can be built, make it more expensive to build the housing that is built. And as you said, take longer time to get the housing that's built approved, which means it's more expensive. But the fact that he said the city has put us in this housing crisis, I found kind of interesting. And that he described the city as having policy zealots. What do you think of that comment?
Well, I think there are two sides of it. It's not entirely the city. Remember, like the Places Grow Act pretty aggressively restricted urban sprawl. Now, whether that's good or bad, the reality is that means less housing of that type gets built, which means we need more housing of a different type, which means that municipalities need to have plans and processes that allow for that to happen. Now, all those things that you noted are things that reduce the ability or increase the cost to develop. So there certainly is a lot to that. As much as we want to have some accommodation for existing homeowners, the balance has been tilted quite a bit towards them. And in a metropolitan area where nearly half the people are renting, it seems kind of arbitrary to say that we need to go that far towards accommodating existing homeowners versus everybody else.
How'd you get into this line of policy research? It sounds very niche.
Well, it is and it isn't. As somebody who who aged into an expensive housing market, it's a top of mind issue for me and frankly everybody of my generation. And it's one where I think there's a lack of creativity a lot of the times. You think about it, every city in North America had pretty similar zoning policies, minimum parking requirements and that sort of thing for a long period of time. And we were uncritical about it because in most places it didn't work out too badly for a long time. And now all of a sudden it's a big problem in places like Toronto and Vancouver. So as much as we like to think that the way that things worked, or a lot of people like to think that the ways that worked in the 50s and 60s can work forever, it just doesn't really bear out. Not when you're running up against things like just a lack of developable land and a lot of people moving here.
So you commented about parking ratios previously, and that the city of Toronto has relaxed some of that. I understand they're now putting in bike storage requirements, though. And I guess my question is, one would think that developers would actually build what the market wants and is willing to pay for. So why is it that city staff have to tell the developers how many parking units they need to have and how many bike storage units they need to have and things like that? Why don't they just have the flexibility and the freedom to build what the market actually wants? Because one would think that over time, if the market wants more parking, they'll build more parking. If the market wants more bike stands, they'll build more bike stands and people will pay for it. Why does government regulatory people in the planning department need to tell developers that?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I certainly agree with what you're saying there. I think part of the challenge is that there's, because most surface parking in most cities tends not to be priced, or at least not market priced. The concern is that you have a condo building or a rental apartment building go up, and then all of a sudden people will, take advantage of the underpriced parking nearby, and therefore other people will have less parking. There is a solution to that.
It's the parking.
Pricing all parking. If all parking is priced according to the market, then you don't have a problem anymore.
Some people have suggested that might be more powerful than carbon taxes, like actually charge for parking and people will drive less.
Well, it's also when you think about it, we've got these long-standing debates about toll roads in Toronto and the GTA, which despite the evidence that tolling is the single most effective way to reduce traffic congestion, there's not a lot of interest in it. And in fact, we seem to be going in the opposite direction.
Yeah. So Premier Ford's just announced, 412 and 418 won't be tolled.
Yeah.
Is that smart, or is that just something for election bait?
It's certainly not my preference. But what I will say, though, is that you can get a lot of the same effect by just pricing parking correctly. And even if you're not too concerned about traffic congestion, even if you're not concerned about the impact on emissions, et cetera, I think there's a basic question of fairness. Should I have to spend $100,000 on a parking spot I'm not going to use? I find that that would be a very hard argument to make for me.
No, of course you shouldn't have to spend $100,000 on a parking space you're going to use. So how do we change things if government has become far more involved in telling us how much parking, how much bikes, and what our density is, and what heights? How do you change all that?
Well, I'm glad to see that the Ontario government commissioned this housing report. That's a good step. I think that a lot of the recommendations, I can't vouch for everyone because I haven't read everyone carefully, and I don't have opinions about necessarily everyone. But as a broad thrust, it is a good report. If a large portion of the recommendations are implemented, that will go a long way towards helping. And I make no mistake, even if they implemented every single recommendation in there, this is a multi-year process to fix things. You don't just go from having a shortage of housing and really high housing prices to not overnight. It's not a flick of a switch, but it could be the start of the solution and the start towards getting towards a more healthy housing market. Now, whether that happens or not, obviously it's difficult. Politics is messy, and it's often hard to really kind of communicate the importance of these really niche sounding issues. But if they were to implement a lot of these recommendations, that could go a long way.
You mentioned the places to go legislation, and you said it was restrictive, and the Greenbelt restrictive. Were those good decisions or bad decisions?
I mean, there's a lot to weigh there. You know, I don't have an informed opinion about whether it was the right or wrong way to do it. But if your objective as a government is to reduce urban sprawl, you know, like, then you have to build somewhere else. And we haven't done that to the extent we needed to.
I had a interesting interview with Joe Barrage of Urban Strategies, a fairly reputable planning organization and individual, and he was saying the problem is not the Greenbelt. The problem is that the places to grow legislation increased the desired zoning in what he called I guess it was the blue zone or the gray zone, which are areas within inside the Greenbelt, and industrial or within the Greenbelt and not developed as of yet. And he said the problem is that cities in the 905 haven't increased their zoning equivalent to, or their official plans anywhere equivalent to what the places to grow legislation was. So that the problem was in the Greenbelt, the problem was density within the 905 suburbs. What do you think? Well,
that's the trade-off. So, you know, it's, I guess, saying one or the other is the problem is a bit subjective, but within the confines of there being the Places to Grow Act, then the problem is, yes, that there hasn't been enough development allowed. Part of the challenge too, you think about it, I mean, the Ontario government, as well as the city of Toronto, for instance, spends a lot of money on ensuring that there's pretty extensive public transportation. But also at the same time, we don't necessarily make it easy to build new units by subway lines, streetcar lines, and so forth. So then you've got these expenses that can be justified based on people using them, but also preventing people from building nearby. I think especially when we're making really large capital expenditures on subways, for instance, we need to be really mindful that in order to justify it, you need to allow more density along it. Otherwise, what are you doing? Why are you building a subway that's just a single detached house? That doesn't make a lot of sense.
I had Jennifer Keesmaat, the former head of planning in Toronto, on, and she said that the right thing that happened when we built the Yonge Street subway is we increased zoning and allowed the kind of development that you've just described. She said the wrong thing to do was that we didn't do the same thing on the Bloor-Danforth line. What do you think?
I don't know the history as well as she does. She would certainly know it better than I do, but I'm inclined to defer to her on that. Obviously, as the chief planner, she would know, or former chief planner, she would know a lot better than I do. But that sounds like a logical argument to me.
But you've been across Toronto. You've been across Bloor and Danforth. It's not nearly as dense.
On the Bloor-Danforth line, yes. I guess thinking about some of the neighborhoods that are on that line and some of the communities that surround it, that sounds right. There's a lot of room for more density there.
There's no Yonge and Eglinton. There's no Yonge and Shepherd. There's no even Yonge and St. Clair.
I mean, if you go out west, for instance, and you get towards Ossington Avenue, you walk south and it's, you get to West Queen West and it's very kind of nightlife trendy. And then you walk a little bit north and then it's all single attached, or it's mostly lower intensity development. So that certainly is the case. You could fit a lot more density in a lot of places along the Bloor line for sure. And, I'll come back to it. There's often an assumption or an insinuation made when we talk about densifying neighborhoods that it means we're going to, turn them into slums or something like that. I defy anybody to go to Cabbagetown or to Leslieville or the beaches and say, this is a slum. I mean, there's a reason why people are paying $2-3 million for houses. They're really nice.
Yeah,
and they're nice communities, and we can
Bloor West Village or Port Credit or Streetsville. Not even in the places you've talked about, but actually, I had someone in that said that single-family homes are typically 6 units per acre or less, and condos are typically 100 units per acre or more. But most people actually like living in communities that are like 20 to 40 units per acre, which would be what you've described as Cabbagetown, Leslieville, Beaches, Port Credit, Bloor West Village, Swansea, etc.
and I'll make myself a little bit of a villain here. I used to live in a 50-story apartment in downtown, and I decided I wanted a slightly quieter neighborhood, so I moved into a 5-story building. And unfortunately, there are only about 3 buildings within my neighborhood that fit my specification because of policy choices we made. So yes, certainly, a lot of people want to live in that kind of missing middle. And we should let them.
We're chatting tonight with Steve LaFleur. He is a policy analyst with the Fraser Institute. He's recently written an article on more flexibility for single-family home zoning, and he's commented on this Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force report and one of their key recommendations. And he thinks we need more housing that would be described as the missing middle to allow more housing, more density, more walkable, livable neighborhoods, I presume. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga Night 60. It's been a real interesting evening chatting tonight with Steve LaFleur, who is a senior policy analyst with the Fraser Institute. He's commented about one of the recommendations that recently has come out from the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force, which is to remove or change the zoning for single-family homes in Toronto and allow you to, without needing anyone else's approval, it's sort of an as-of right opportunity to convert your home into 4 different dwelling units. So I presume like basement apartments or a duplex or renting out a room or something like that. And more easily try to create a what he's described as the missing middle to try to increase housing supply. Steve, there's an issue here, and it was actually, I think, best sort of displayed in the last federal leaders debate when Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, was asked about housing affordability, and he said the question was, the problem is, what to do about housing affordability, and his answer was, he said the problem is young people that aren't in the market yet want more supply and lower prices, but older people that have created their net worth in the house don't necessarily want lower prices. They like the fact that they've created their retirement income and their net worth through housing prices. What's the solution?
So there is that consideration that people who are looking to buy houses might look at the world differently than people that own houses. One thing I will point out is that I think a lot of these concerns are overblown. So a lot of people think that allowing more intense uses means that prices will go down. That depends on a lot. For one thing, if you think about it, if you're selling off a unit or a piece of land that was previously designated for 1 unit, and all of a sudden you can build 4, then the value of that land might actually go up because all of a sudden a developer can build 4 times as many units. So I don't think it's as clear cut as some people would argue, but I do think it goes back to that balance between, how much consideration are we giving to renters versus owners, long-standing residents versus new residents. And I just think the balance hasn't been right recently. At the end of the day, if people are going to own property, they should be allowed to use it to a large extent how they want, so long as they aren't doing too much undue harm to other people. I'm not saying that you should be able to open a nightclub in the middle of a residential neighborhood, but I do think that it's kind of hard to justify why you can have 4 people in a single detached house, but not have 2 people living on each side of a duplex.
We've been chatting tonight with Steve LaFleur. He is an analyst with the Fraser Institute. And we've been talking about single-family zoning and needed flexibility and the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force. Let me end with my own 2 cents on this topic, if I could. I think that government has been a bit of a problem, if not a lot of the problem. I think that government has been, number one, overly focused on the existing housing stock and the existing electorate and not thinking about the future and the influx of immigrants or other people that might be coming to their communities, whether it's Mississauga or Toronto or where not, and planning for the housing that they need and thinking about flexibility in regards to density, height, parking requirements, bike requirements. I think that the development industry is unbelievably regulated, where architects are told by planning departments more than a lot of product planners would be told by any other government regulator, other than maybe in the drug industry, about the products that they're putting forward. They comment on the windows, they comment on the materials, they comment on the setbacks, they comment on as you mentioned earlier, Steve, shading, so that the regulatory environment that builders, developers are in is slow and cumbersome and restrictive. And I think that's led to unbelievably high prices because we've got less supply than we should. And I think government regulation and zoning has actually been more of a problem than it's been a help. And I think that the Housing Affordability Task Force has a bunch of recommendations that's set to remove a bunch of that regulation and remove a bunch of the NIMBYism and allow more free enterprise, which I think is generally good. And so, Steve, I appreciate your column and your involvement and your comments today. And that's my 2 cents to add to what you had to say.
Well, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Well, that's the show for tonight. Thanks for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from a house downtown Toronto at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and video casts are on after the fact at briancrombie.com. My videos are on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And my podcasts are on Audible, Apple, and Speakeasy. Thanks for joining me, everybody. Thank you, Steve. Good night.